All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. We'll be in Mark chapter 9 tonight. So, doing kind of a precursor to the Sunday school stuff, so I'm glad I get to go first so nobody's up here arguing with me about what they learned last Sunday. But we'll start in verse 14 and end in verse 29. So, and let's open with a word of prayer. Our God and Father, just thank you for this evening. Thank you for the beautiful colors outside as the trees change. Just thank you that you've preserved your word throughout the centuries. Help us to faithfully preserve it to the next generation, to teach it. May you pierce our hearts tonight that we may learn it and ingrain it in our lives, Father. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Mark chapter 9:14. And when they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them, and scribes arguing with them. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, were greatly amazed, and ran up to him and greeted him. And he asked them, "What are you arguing about with them?" And someone from the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able." And he answered them, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me." And they brought the boy to him. And when the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood, and it has often cast him into the fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." And Jesus said to him, "If you can, all things are possible for one who believes." Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, "I believe, help my unbelief." And when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by his hand and lifted him up, and he rose. And when he had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why could we not cast it out?" And he said to them, "This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer." So Jesus comes down from the Mount of Transfiguration with James, Peter, and John, and they meet up with the other disciples. And when they come up, they see a great crowd around them, and they see the scribes and the disciples arguing. So Jesus asks, "What's the problem? What's the confrontation about here?" Notice the disciples don't answer. How much shame must have filled them when seeing their teacher come. Jesus never argued with them. He just told them how it was. But the disciples come down and with Jesus, and they see the other ones arguing. And so we see their great shame in that they don't answer. And it says, "A man from the crowd." But it's not just any man. It's the father of the boy with the demon. He's the one who has to say what's going on. The Pharisees don't answer, and neither do the disciples. Both are ashamed at Jesus' presence. We see that what the conflict is obviously about. The man says, "I brought my child to you, but I only found your disciples, and they couldn't help." The disciples here, they say, "Oh, I've seen Jesus cast out demons before. We cast demons out once when Jesus sent us out. We've got this." And so they attempt to cast the demon out and are unsuccessful. And that's when the conflict arises. The scribes immediately pounce upon the situation, and they say, I knew that he wasn't sent from God. If he was, you disciples would have been able to cast that demon out." And so the disciples, shamed, they've got two choices: act in pride or humility. They take the choice that I often take, and it's pride. And when it's wounded, what do? We immediately defend ourselves. Well, you guys are just too loud in here. If you'd quiet down, I could have cast that demon out. If Andrew wasn't over there breathing so loud, we all make excuses. And so surely that's what they've done here. They've made excuses and get into an argument with the scribes instead of running to Christ in their weakness. And so what does this portray? One, it's a bad testimony. The disciples should have had the best testimony of anybody. They should have been exemplary in their lifestyle as pertaining to Christ. But instead, as soon as he's gone, they're bickering and fighting, trying to elevate themselves, trying to show that it's not really their fault and it's just circumstances. But that's what most of us do, if we're being honest. And so their bad testimony not only reflects on Christ, but it causes their brothers to stumble. It causes others to lose faith. And so it's not just damaging to them and to Christ's image, but it's damaging to everybody around. And so we see when the boy's father cries out, "Help my unbelief," we see that the disciples had led him to that path, and they'd caused Christ's image in his eyes to be lowered, to be denigrated, because he says, "If you can." He believed Jesus would. He didn't say if you would. He said if you can. He didn't know if he could. After the disciples had portrayed him so poorly with their faith, they'd caused their weaker brother to stumble. So that's the situation that Jesus walks into. And in frustration, he cries out and rebukes them. In verse 19, he says, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me." Now, who's this rebuke to? Who is the faithless generation? Surely it's the disciples. They didn't have faith. They didn't cast the demon out like they should have. But it's also to the Pharisees. As soon as, or the scribes, it says, I keep saying Pharisees, to the scribes, as soon as they saw a chance to pounce, as soon as they saw weakness to stir up strife, they did. So the scribes are part of that wicked and faithless generation. They didn't care to help. They weren't looking with compassion upon that father. They were gleeful that the child had a demon, that they might bring a charge against Christ and his followers. And it falls to the crowd. In chapter 8 of Mark, we see that Jesus feeds the 4,000. He'd fed the 5,000 before. He'd done many miracles. Surely the crowd knew of his miracles. The scribes certainly did. They just ignored them. But the crowd, why would there have been a crowd if they didn't know of his miracles? They all came to see and to hear the great teacher. But nobody says, Jesus can do it. I've seen him do it before. I saw him take 5 loaves and 2 fishes and turn it into a multitude. Nobody says that. The crowd is just as faithless as the disciples and the Pharisees. But surely the harshest rebuke falls upon the disciples because they lived with Jesus for 2.5 years now, following him around, seeing his miracles, doing miracles themselves. And yet here, instead of looking to God and looking to Christ for strength, they look upon themselves. And their unbelief hinders God's work. Unbelief always hinders God's work and prevents God's blessings from falling upon others. The man's son is healed, so surely God had intended for the demon to be cast out. Would the demon not have been cast out sooner if the disciples had just believed, if they had had the faith to cast him out? Surely it would have, but they don't. And so the demon remains for hours, maybe days longer, who knows? But it remains all the longer and hinders the blessings that God intended for that child and for that father to have. And so for that, Jesus rebukes them for being faithless and wicked. And when the boy is brought to him, the demon immediately convulses the boy, and he falls on the ground, rolling about, foaming at the mouth. Jesus is unfazed. His next question is, so how long has he been like this? It's like going to the doctor and you tell him of this terrible disease you have, and he goes, oh, well, how long have you had that? He's getting the backstory on it. What that shows us, how great was Satan's assault in that last minute before victory was declared by Christ. Christ is completely unfazed by the demon, but the demon, terrified and angry and whatever else they feel, does an all-out assault on the boy, convulsing him, foaming at the mouth, rolling and thrashing, so much that at the end, when the demon's gone, it looks like the boy's dead because he's no longer animated by an evil spirit. How much fear is there in the demons of Christ? It shows just how little Christ cares for the demons. He's completely unfazed. It's no problem for him. But the demon, having struggled with all he has, gains nothing. Now, in verse 22, and has often cast him into the fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Once again, we see the faltering faith. Surely he believed. He wouldn't have come. He'd already believed. If I had a demon-possessed son, and I see a guy on TV telling me he can cast the demon out, there's no way I'm going to that guy and looking a fool in front of everybody, risking him telling me that he can't cast the demon out if I don't actually believe. Nobody's shown up to that guy. But this man traveled 1 day, 2 days, however far, because he believed. And it's only now, after seeing the failing of the disciples, that he says, if you can. So we see him having faltering faith. And Jesus said to him, if you can. It's not necessarily a rebuke. I don't read it that way. I think what Jesus is pointing out is the faultiness in his logic. It's not if you can, it's if you believe. Believe and your son will be healed. Jesus is propping up the man. He's exhorting him to believe. And immediately the father of the boy cries out, I believe. Help my unbelief. Isn't that where we all are? Do any of us believe 100%? I certainly don't. I know I often am doing things, and I'm wondering in the back of my head, is this really going to help me? Is this really any good? And so, we can easily identify with this man and his faltering faith if we're honest. And we can easily identify with the disciples and their pride. in their reaction to that situation, if we're honest. So we see ourselves in both of these places, that we need to cry out, not in argument, not in conflict, but in belief. Help my unbelief. The man has the response that the disciples should have had when they failed to cast out the demon. They should have cried out, Lord, help my unbelief, that my faith may be strengthened and the demon may be gone. We also, a quick side note here, we see the goodness of God in our current state. As far as I know, none of us are possessed by demons. It says the man's child had a demon from birth. We see the great kindness of God and that our children aren't possessed by demons. And we should think about that, because demons are not often thought about in America. And we just think, oh, it's mental illness or stress or anything else. And we should see the great kindness of God, that we ourselves are not afflicted with these things. This child was no more unrighteous than the rest of us when he was born, yet for whatever reason he was possessed. We see Jesus' reaction to all of this. As soon as the man says, help my unbelief, in verse 25, when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, you mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. He does more than is asked for. The man just says, if you can, have compassion and please get rid of this demon. But Jesus goes beyond that. He blesses the man further and says, and never re-enter, you evil spirit. Don't come back. We also see Jesus' great insight. The man says it's a mute spirit. Jesus says it's a mute and deaf spirit. Jesus knows our afflictions even more than we know our afflictions. He knew far more than the man did. And I don't know how old the child is. 15 years? He's had a child for 15 years. And he doesn't even know the full extent of the affliction. Jesus knows within seconds. And he casts him out, and he cleanses him, allows him not only to speak, but restores his hearing as well. The man's reaction, I believe, help my unbelief, is the reaction that every single one of us should have when faced with situations where we don't believe and where we are wondering, can Jesus really help me? But see, you have to have faith first. Faith that desires more faith. It craves it, that it might be built up and that it might better honor God. Do we crave more faith? Do we crave that God would be more glorified in our trusting of him? What do we say? I'm saved. It's good enough. We should all be incited by this man's statement. Help my unbelief. Lord, help me that I would believe as I ought to, that I would glorify you as I ought to. We see here in these last verses, once again, the difference between the two kingdoms. We see Satan's kingdom convulses him, full of violence, looks like he's dead. Satan and his demons bring nothing but death and destruction and pain and affliction. Jesus brings life. Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he rose. Jesus brought life where only death reigned before. In the end, the disciples come to Jesus in private, and they say, "What's the deal? Why couldn't we cast the demons out? You gave us dominion over them before when we went out. We cast them out, we healed people. How come we couldn't do it this time?" And that's the great temptation of being a Christian or of being a disciple for a long time, is to look back and say, "Oh, well, I've done it all these years. I've got it this time. How many times have I shared the gospel? 1,000? 1,001's no big deal. I've got it." And we look back on our past experiences thinking they will fuel future victories. We look back in pride thinking it is our accomplishment, that we shared the gospel in our own power those 1,000 times or whatever it is, and that it wasn't God upholding us and using us as a tool that entire time. We turn to ourselves and we utterly fail. And so we see the disciples' reaction is pride. The other reaction is humility. Our great need should drive us to Christ. When we see our need, that we don't have the faith, that we don't have the desire, that we aren't doing and living as we ought to, because we are wicked and because of our own problems, it should drive us to Christ, that we would flee to him and not only beg for his strengthening, but beg for his outpouring of power through prayer. We never outgrow our need for Christ and for prayer. At the end there it says, in verse 29, it says, "And he said to them, 'This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer.'" It's not talking about a specific type of demon. It's talking about spiritual battles, spiritual victories. If you do not pray before you seek to engage in spiritual battles, you are relying on the arm of the flesh. And the arm of the flesh is absolutely useless in a spiritual battle. And you will be denied victory, just as the disciples were. If you do not pray, if I do not pray before we engage in spiritual battles, where is God's glory? If I just go out there and I just do it, maybe the first time I say, "Oh, well, God strengthened me." But if I do that another 50 times, eventually I'm going to say, "Well, I'm just awesome. Why aren't you awesome like me, Jerry? Why don't you just go out there and get it done?" And we look to ourselves in pride. God will not honor that. He tells you power comes through prayer. And if we do not go and pray for whatever it is, if it's a temptation, if it's to evangelize, if it's before your marriage, before marriage counseling, for your children, whatever it is, if you do not pray for it, you will have no power in the Spirit. God will not honor it. And perhaps it will work out all right. But that is because God is kind and gracious, not because we have done what we should. Also in verse 29, it says, "Can't by anything but prayer." What we should also note here is that prayer is not a magical incantation that you get up there and you just say a couple of Hail Marys or whatever else it may be, recite some liturgies, and well, what do you know? I've got God by the arm, got it twisted behind his back, and now he has to answer me. Some people take prayer to be that now, well, I prayed, so God owes me. It's not what it is at all. Man's prayers don't move God, but God moves man through his prayers. We may think it does absolutely nothing, but God is slowly changing our hearts as we pray. and that neighbor that you have, that you think he's just the worst person in the world, the most wretched person ever was with a heart of stone, start praying for him and see that his heart will be softened. God hears our prayers, and he uses them to bring about his ends and his means. I'll end with a little example. Hopefully you know this book. It's a children's book. It's called The Little Engine That Could. I don't know when this book was popular, but in it, there's a couple of trains. One train has all sorts of good things, candy and toys and whatever else, that it's got to get over the mountain to the next village, but it breaks down. And so a big shiny engine comes along that it'd be no problem for it to pull it. And the little engine says, "Can you help me?" And the big shiny engine says, indignantly, "I'm far too important to help you." That's the Pharisees. That's all the Pharisees. They're far too important to help the man. They weren't concerned for the man's problem whatsoever. And then another train comes along, far smaller, apparently insignificant. And the broken down train says, "Can you help me?" And the train says, "I think I can." And in the story, it pulls it up over the mountain the whole time saying, "I think I can. I think I can." And that's our problem. Somebody asks us for help, and we say, "Oh, I think I can help." But halfway up that mountain, unlike in the story, we stall out if we even get halfway up, because we're saying, "I think I can. I think I can." It's all about I. I can do it. And that's not what it's about. We should be saying, "I know God can. I know God can." There should be no doubt. And it should all be pointing towards God. And so, when we're faced with difficult situations, or maybe even easy situations this week, when we're tempted to do things our way, when we're tempted to defend ourselves in pride for past failures, let us humbly cry out to God, "I believe. Help my unbelief." With that, we'll turn our attention to prayer, as is fitting. Does anybody have anything new to add to the prayer sheet? Or Teddy Reed has pneumonia? Okay. Anything else? If not, would someone like to close us in prayer? All right. Before you close us in prayer, David, I think we ought to take 5 minutes or so to pray silently and corporately, after having talked about how much prayer is important and seeing the great needs on our list. So everybody can just pray for a few minutes silently for the needs brought before us, and then David will close in a few minutes. Israel? All right.